Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I'm used to doing these in the morning. I'm not used to waiting until the afternoon to get started. Hope everyone is doing well today. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started on our underwriting with Andrea and covering alcohol use versus abuse and how we get these through the system and get policies in force. So we're just going to jump right in and start here. All right, so alcohol use in the US. Um, Interestingly enough, what I have found is that alcohol is used by only about 44% of the US adult population, which is actually a little lower than I expected. Um, but on a monthly, at least a monthly basis, it is used by 44% of the US adult population. What we have also found is that slightly over 16% are what we would consider heavy drinkers, and will meet the criteria for some kind of an alcohol related disorder. So why does all of this matter? Well, here are some interesting statistics that I found. Alcohol misuse in the US is responsible for approximately 100,000 deaths each year and approximately $150 billion each year. So definitely something that has an impact for everyone. Alcohol use is involved in at least half of all motor vehicle accidents. It is involved in approximately 2/3 of all homicides and 1/3 of all suicides. It has also been noted that the problems are highest among younger individuals between the ages of 18 to 29, and it is lowest among those that are age 65 and over. We did find over age 29 that each decade of life, alcohol problems tend to decrease each decade in between that 30 to 65 age range. 1 in 10 adults are likely to have some kind of an issue with alcoholism some point throughout their life. Um, I don't like to confuse the word alcohol use with alcoholism or dependency. Those are all very different things. Somebody who has a problem with alcoholism at some point in their life does not necessarily make them an alcoholic. That is absolutely not what I'm saying. But 1 in 10 adults will have some kind of issue with alcoholism at some point, whether temporary or chronic. And interestingly enough, heavy alcohol use is often associated with a history of heavy tobacco use. Um, I don't know about you guys, but I've got those friends that are not regular smokers, whether that be cigarettes, cigars, whatever the case may be, but then they have a couple drinks and all of a sudden they need a cigarette or all of a sudden they want a cigar. That is definitely very common. That is not out of the ordinary at all. So for the, young guy or girl who's at the bachelor or bachelorette party and had that one cigarette that one time because they were drinking, don't let them do their paramed that week. All right. So how do we define use? How is this measured in underwriting and in medical records and by doctors and by all the professionals out there, the experts? So what they say is considered one drink is going to be a 12-ounce can of beer, your typical beer, a 5-ounce glass of wine, or one shot of liquor, 1.5 ounce shot there. So each one of these would be equivalent to one another, and how we typically measure how much use is occurring. When we start to look at the potential for binge drinking, this is going to be defined as the consumption of 5 or more drinks per sitting for males and 4 or more drinks per sitting in females. Um, and obviously, studies have shown that this does carry a risk for mortality that is kind of additive to the average numbers of drinks that are consumed daily. So, for somebody who just has one drink each night, not a big deal. But then on the weekend, they're drinking a case. That kind of changes the whole story because then we're looking at some binge drinking patterns that are separate from maybe their daily patterns, but still definitely taken into consideration when we look at these things. Okay, so we figured out how we measure it. So how do we actually define what is abuse versus just casual, social, regular drinking? Heavy drinking alone absolutely does not classify an individual as an alcoholic. Again, we are definitely not trying to say that. But drinking in excessive amounts does have an impact on our mortality that we do have to take into consideration. So, the terms problem drinking and alcoholism, they're oftentimes used synonymously, but researchers in the field have actually differentiated between those two. What they have published is that problem drinkers, they tend to have a shorter problem drinking history. They have greater social and financial stability, and they have greater personal resources than we typically see with alcoholism. Problem drinkers, they do drink heavily and they may experience an occasional problem due to their drinking, but they don't typically have the physical dependence on alcohol. They can reduce their alcohol usage without any outside assistance or any major side effects. Whereas with alcoholism, we're looking at a chronic disease, and this is going to be marked by continued drinking despite any kind of ongoing alcohol related problems, such as marital problems, job loss, trouble with the law. um, when we start to see those things and there's still no ability to stop drinking, that is where we start to label this more as alcoholism. So this will again show that compulsion to drink, an inability to limit their drinking, withdrawal symptoms when they stop. You may hear the term DTs or tremors. These are the kind of things we see. They may need to increase the amount they drink in order to feel the effects, so they've got a higher tolerance. Um, and so just kind of to keep that in mind, there is a big difference in the two. Um, Alcohol dependence, they've also broken this down a little bit further. Alcohol dependence includes all the same characteristics of alcohol abuse, um, plus the evidence of increased tolerance and physical signs of withdrawal again. So there is definitely a bit of a difference there in how we look at these things. And so when looking at alcoholism, we also like to look at the cause. So some of the most common causes are going to be genetics. Sometimes it is a genetic predisposition. It runs in the family, and that has been proven with lots of testing. Um, Psychological issues can also influence alcoholism, whether it's depression, anxiety, um, just a personality of dependency and impulsivity. All those things can kind of play into this. It can be an occupational hazard. Primary example being bartenders, but we also see this in very high stress job in sales. There's all sorts of different occupations where it's more accepted and even encouraged, if you will. And then a history of multiple drug uses, that can also come into play. That's something we see oftentimes as polydrug use. It's not usually just alcohol drinking. So when it comes to alcoholism, we usually do see more than just one substance being used or abused in that situation. And then there's the environmental and interpersonal factors. It could just be the way you grew up, the attitudes towards drinking, expectations of the effects that alcohol is going to have on your mood or behavior. Maybe you want to have a drink to help you lighten up or relax or calm some anxiety before you go into a certain situation. Um, so, a lot of personal experiences with alcohol and stress and just life in general, all those things can have a big impact on how we view and use alcohol in our lives. So, why does all this matter again to underwriting, and what are the mortality considerations? Well, alcoholism, not alcohol drinking, but alcoholism can and does shorten the lifespan from what they're estimating it to be about 10 to 15 years. Accidents are the leading cause of increased mortality and morbidity when it comes to drinking. And then studies do show that there is an 11 to 15% time risk of suicide with alcoholism. So that is also something that they have to take into consideration there. All right, so what are some of the common complications that we see with alcohol use or heavy alcohol use and alcoholism? One of them being cardiac arrhythmias, cardiomyopathy, fatty liver. That's one that I know a lot of people here on approved other than applied for and declined cases and rated cases all the time. Fatty liver comes up often. It's not always related to alcohol use. There is a non-alcoholic fatty liver diagnosis as well. So anytime we see fatty liver, please do not assume that means it's related to alcohol because it's not always. Cirrhosis of the liver is another one that we see oftentimes in heavy alcohol use or abuse. Pancreatitis is one that if we see that in the medical records, it's typically going to be a decline unless we can prove it was not alcohol related and it was a one-time occurrence and fully resolved, then we can maybe get by. But if there is any indication of alcohol abuse with pancreatitis, that is not going to go forward, I'm afraid. Additionally, they look at gastritis, peptic ulcer disease, esophagitis, alcoholic hepatitis, DTs or tremors, especially during withdrawal. Some of the other complications could be neuropathy. I know we hear that term all the time in diabetes, but it is also common in alcoholism, and then encephalopathy, which is going to be a brain issue and will also be a decline. But these are just some of the complications that can arise, and that when we see these in medical records, we typically, try to look at it very holistically and see if alcohol abuse is playing any part in any of these diagnoses if we do see those in records. All right, so what are some of the things that underwriting is going to look for when underwriting an abuse or heavy usage history? Obviously, one of the first things we're going to ask for is going to be an APS. We are going to be looking, if there is an abuse history or a heavy usage history, we'll be looking for evidence of that esophagitis, of gastritis, any kind of GI bleeds, arrhythmias, unexplained seizures, DTs, an elevated MCV, which is a blood test. Those are things we're going to be on the lookout for. If there has been any kind of treatment, we will definitely be getting statements, medical statements, APSs from that treatment facility or facilities if there's more than one, just to see how that process went, what medications may have been required, side effects, so on and so forth. Oftentimes an inspection report may be requested. It's something we don't see quite as often anymore. Because of all the background reports that are available now, I don't see it requested nearly as often, but in the past, that was a common one. Motor vehicle report, always going to look at that MVR for any kind of issues, whether it be DUI, reckless driving, suspended license, all those kinds of things. In the lab work, they will run a blood profile and definitely run extra alcohol markers if there is any kind of suspicion. Obviously, we always look at LFTs or the liver function test, the most common being the AST, ALT, GGT. If those are elevated, that can definitely be a clue that we need to dig a little bit further. The CDT is probably the one that I see the most often that ends up prompting declined cases. The CDT is not the same as like your blood alcohol content. They will also run a BAC to make sure that the labs aren't positive for recent use. I've seen those come back positive a couple times, and that will be an instant decline. But the CDT is different. It actually measures heavy usage over a period of time. It doesn't just look at, hey, this guy's blood alcohol content's positive because he was drinking heavily last night. The CDT is more of a month to a couple months look back. It takes a while for that number to go down. Oftentimes, we will see that CDT elevated after somebody's just gotten back from a cruise or been on a vacation on the beach, drinking those sunny limeritas or pineapple daiquiris or whatever. Um, you drink heavily for a week or two, like, on vacation or around the holidays is another time that CDT can elevate. And that positive CDT, 9 times out of 10, is going to prompt a decline. Occasionally, I've seen those get reversed. Typically, we have to do new labs. We need to be able to provide some kind of explanation for why that CDT was elevated, and it will always require complete medical records from a primary care physician showing absolutely no abuse history, no negative criticisms regarding alcohol use. Um, and so it can be reversed occasionally, but it does not happen very often, unfortunately. And when it does, it's still usually pretty rated. So typically I tell agents, again, don't let your client come home and do a paramed 1 week after a huge long booze cruise, or New Year's Eve parties, bachelor parties, like all these big things that can prompt a little extra drinking. We don't want to do parameds shortly after those. um, and then one of the other things that we're always going to ask for with any kind of alcohol abuse suspicion at all is going to be an alcohol usage questionnaire. This can be really, really helpful, especially in situations where the client hasn't necessarily kept their doctor up to date on how things are changing. You may have a 23-year-old who had a couple comments in their APS about how he needs to back off on drinking so much on the weekends, and maybe now he's 26 and he actually doesn't drink at all anymore because he just didn't like it, but he's never really mentioned that to his doctor. So the medical records now are a little bit misleading for the underwriter. And so that alcohol usage questionnaire is a good way for us to clarify any information that's just not adding up, or is a little conflicting, or is just simply out of date. All right, so when it comes to the test and the procedures that we are going to be looking for in the records or doing ourselves, there's going to be a few different ways that can go. The liver function test, again, we've all heard about those when we get labs back on clients. Otherwise known as the LFTs. Again, the most common ones that you're going to see or hear about are probably going to be the AST, the ALT, GGT, maybe the bilirubin. Um, those are first and foremost, and those are on every insurance lab. So we always get those, even if there's no indication of any kind of abuse history or just use at all. We always get the liver function test. The HAA and the CDT are going to be run. Again, that CDT is a key one that we always look for, and if that is positive, it will trigger extra requirements and questions and potentially a decline. The MCV, or the macrocytosis, um, and also the HDL. If that is elevated, that's part of the cholesterol reading. If that's elevated, that can be an indication that there is also a problem. They usually look for that to be over 70 in men and over 85 in females, and that's when they get a little concerned and start to wonder what's happening. And then BAC, otherwise known as blood alcohol content. That is run on most insurance labs, and if that is positive, that is going to be decline, and there's no way around it. There's no getting out of it. Believe me, I've tried. We had I had one not too long ago that was a young man who was at a bachelor party just that weekend, and apparently got up first thing in the morning to do his exam, and his blood alcohol content was still positive, and therefore he was declined. And the real concern or issue with these, once a policy is declined for something like that, is that we don't have a lot of options anymore. I've had agent after agent ask me, well, can't we just apply somewhere else? And unfortunately, that does not do us any good. Typically, once these labs have been done, one, they're going to be reported to MIB. So even if carrier X declines it and you move to carrier Y is going to see that MIB hit, even if the labs are clean, and they're not going to offer on it either. Those labs are visible to every other carrier for basically a full year if they want to pull them. And so moving companies is not an option, unfortunately, when we run into that blood alcohol content. Now, again, we can try with the CDT, but it is a very, very, very difficult journey to get past that one. Usually in these situations, what we end up having to do is postpone for about a year. And once they are a year out from any kind of labs, then we can reapply. And yes, the MIB code will still be out there, but the labs will no longer be visible. We can explain away everything that's happened. So usually we're at about a 1 year waiting period. Okay. So the treatments and the medications that we most commonly see or look for. Um, Obviously, if there is an abuse history, not use, abuse, then abstinence from alcohol is going to be the desired outcome. If somebody has gone through any kind of rehab or treatment, then abstinence is going to be key in order to obtain coverage. Typically, we look at about a 3 to 5 year waiting period. A lot of different factors are taken into consideration, ranging from the client's age, their gender, their social history, all sorts of things play into that. Um, but when there is treatment involved, we want to see abstinence after the fact. Counseling, any kind of psychotherapy, whether it's inpatient or outpatient. Interestingly enough, I've had agents in the past that thought, oh, well, he can't get coverage because he's still in AA. And that is false. Actually, we like to see ongoing uh, care and group therapy and support. And so still being in counseling or groups is not a bad thing. Now, if it's brand new, that's very different. But if you're 5, 10, 15 years out from all of your treatments, but you're just still very active in AA, that's actually a positive. That is a favorable thing from an underwriter's perspective. Oh, Alcoholics Anonymous. See, I jumped the gun on that one. I didn't click my button here. Some of the medications that we also see will be antabuse. A lot of times with these different medications, it will be a decline while taking those meds. They do like to usually see stability a year to 2 years after you're off of these medications. And so we do look at treatment dates, and how long they were on any kind of medication. All those things are taken into consideration as well. And then obviously they're going to look at medications that were used for withdrawal of any of the symptoms and how those worked and how long those were needed. Okay, let's see here. So some of the more negative outcomes, I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but we have to go over what's going to kick them out of the system. Any kind of current alcohol abuse is going to be a decline if you have an abuse history. Somebody who's maybe relapsed from rehab, that's the kind of thing that they are going to decline on that. If there is no disclosure of current alcohol use, but all of the evidence, the current biomarkers do show alcohol use, such as a positive CDT, that's going to be a decline. The carriers are going to err on the side of caution. They're going to wait until that CDT is under control or non-existent. They're going to want to see all the other liver functions under control and in a normal range, if there is a history there. Again, we can sometimes get past this if there's no history, but if there's any history at all, it's game over at that point if that comes back positive. We kind of touched on this, the elevated HDL cholesterol. If those hit certain levels, that can be indicative of a problem and will likely result in a decline. The elevated MCV or the abnormal liver enzymes, again, the ALT, AST, GGT, bilirubin, if those are highly elevated, then they are going to be what we would call a refer to medical director and will typically end in a decline if there is an abuse history there. Any kind of evidence of relapse, they're not going to like that. Unfortunately, one thing we do see sometimes is, this gentleman or this woman has been sober now for 5 years, but there were three relapses and multiple treatment facilities before this. That one's going to prompt a longer postpone period. That one they may postpone for 10 years now because there were relapses. Had there been no relapses, it was a one-time treatment and they'd been, remained sober since then we can usually see offers come in sooner. But if there is any evidence of relapse in between sobriety stints, then we will see a longer postponed period and declines on those as well. APS criticisms. If there is anything in the medical records from the doctor indicating that they're still drinking or they're still drinking too much, then those will typically end in a decline as well. I will say, however, I had a case about a year and a half ago probably, and this gentleman had a very unique doctor who was 100% adamant against any kind of alcohol at all whatsoever. He was very into natural, holistic, vegan kind of mentality there, and he was absolutely zero tolerance for alcohol and had multiple criticisms in the APS regarding the client having an occasional drink. And we had a carrier with a junior underwriter who was very new and read these criticisms and instantly declined it without really paying attention to who the doctor was or some of the things that were going on in these records. And when I was able to finally review it and did a little research on who the doctor was. I won't get into specifics, but they were actually pretty well known in the news. I was able to go back to the carrier, to a senior underwriter, send them an article on the doctor, point out all the criticisms that were being made and what they were being made about, and how very judgmental they really were. They were more personal opinions than they were medical opinions. And we were able to get that moved and reapproved and had no trouble getting that offer once we had the right set of eyes on it. So that was very few and far between kind of situation. It's not anything I've seen before or seen since, but thought it was worth mentioning. Sometimes we can't always just go by what the APS says. We have to look at things holistically and put up a good fight. All right, and then I think last but not least, recent or multiple DUIs. If you've got an alcohol abuse history or a heavy usage history and a recent or multiple DUIs, those are also going to be postpones or declines. And again, that postpone period is going to depend on a lot of things. It's going to depend on the use history, and it's going to depend on the client's age. If it's, somebody who's 23 and they've got their first DUI and multiple comments on their APS about drinking, we're going to see that postponed for a lot longer than the 50-year-old who rarely drinks and has one DUI in their entire lifetime. And, the APS shows that this was an anomaly, so to speak. So they'll be viewed very, very differently. No two clients or histories are the same. So we can't expect them to be underwritten the same. All right, so some of the qualifying criteria that will help in getting offers is going to be there's no serious history of any kind of mental illness. Underwriters get a little nervous when there is a mental health history combined with heavy alcohol use. If there is a history of mild anxiety, mild depressive disorders, they like to see those symptoms in remission for at least 6 consecutive months, or at least very well controlled. Most of the population is on something for either anxiety or depression or both. And so it's not going to kick them out just because they have a couple drinks and have some anxiety. What they're looking for is heavy use and extreme anxiety. But when we're looking at mild anxiety, well controlled, they take one pill a day and they've been on it the last 2, 3 years and it's kept everything stable, that is not going to be problematic. They're looking for something more severe here. Some of the other stuff is going to be know a history of any other substance use disorders. If we've got somebody who has come out of rehab for a heavier drug, let's say methamphetamines, um, they're not going to want to see a heavy alcohol use history there that's still continuing. Um, that's going to be frowned upon, and typically if there's a history of a heavy substance abuse in the past, they're more likely to decline for current alcohol use now. They're also going to want to see no history of any alcohol withdrawal syndromes, um, and no more than 2 treatment episodes in order to reach abstinence. Usually once we start seeing more than 2, it is going to be a very long postponed period before any kind of offer would be made, even 10 to 20 years in some situations, depending on what that history looked like. So more than 2 treatment episodes um, is going to be of concern and probably result in a postpone or decline. Some of the favorable considerations, however, that will help us in getting an offer when this history is present is going to be no history of regular underage drinking. We get a 24 or 25-year-old who's maybe drinking a little too much, and it's going to be in his favor if those records do not show that he's been drinking since he was 15, or something crazy like that. They do like to see a shorter duration from the start of their alcohol use disorder to the first treatment episode. So somebody who maybe got their first DUI at age 30, had no other problems before that, and instantly goes and gets assistance and tries to make a difference in the situation is going to be better than somebody who's now, I've had a couple DUIs and I lost my job and my wife just left me and this has been going on for 5 years and I did not want to seek help. That's going to be viewed a little bit different too. They like to see some proactive, positive measures there. They do like to see regular engagement with the self-help groups such as Alcoholics Anonymous. Like I said, that is not something that we hope to see end. If that's something that the client still is involved in, that is a good thing. Whatever is assisting them is beneficial. Stable occupational and social environments. Someone who has been married long term, had the same job long term. We don't see multiple job changes or even residency, moving every 3 months, 6 months, these kinds of things. They like to see stability because that is definitely key to sobriety and favorable outcomes. And then again, no significant history of any kind of comorbid mental health disorder. So whether that's anxiety, depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, major personality disorders, the more severe the mental health disorder, the less they're going to want to see alcohol abuse mixed with that. And then they want to see compliance with any of the medications that were prescribed, any of the treatment that was prescribed, and obviously, no side effects, nothing negative coming from those. And some of these, it's fine if a client's still on them, like gabapentin for the neuropathy. That's not going to be a bad thing if they're still taking that. On the other hand, a drug such as naltrexone, that one they are likely to postpone until that is no longer needed. So there's lots of different things we look for, how they're being used, how long they're being used, how effective they've been, so on and so forth. All right, so with all that, got a couple case examples here to go over of situations we've seen recently that we maybe were or were not able to cover. First one, we had a male. This gentleman was in his mid 40s, non-smoker, preferred build, everything looked great. He was a recovered alcoholic, admittedly so. Full disclosure, he didn't hold anything back. He stopped drinking 5 years ago. He did not go into any treatment. He did not have any relapses. And he did not participate in any groups like AA. So this is not a requirement that somebody goes to AA. It's just something we like to see if a client needs it. In this situation, he did not feel it was needed. He just quit drinking on his own. And that also showed us a history of elevated liver functions while he was still drinking, but those have resolved. All of his current labs were normal. And when we got the APS, we found that they'd been normal on all his previous 4 readings, which were a couple, 2, 3 years worth. When we shopped this one out, we did unfortunately see a lot of declines. A majority did decline. They did not necessarily like the fact that he had no assistance. Um, there were a few that did come back highly rated. Um, they were willing to take a gander at it, especially considering the last few years of records were very favorable. But at the end of the day, we had one company that came back and offered standard. And when I say we went to every carrier, I want to say there were over 20. And again, there were a few, good handful that came back that were rated. They weren't all declines, but just one came back at standard, which was an amazing offer given how everybody else looked at this. All right, case number 2. So we have another male, mid 50s. He was a smoker. He had a preferred build. His CDT did come back negative. However, his liver function tests were very, very elevated. This gentleman admitted to currently drinking 6 to 12 drinks per week, and that was decreased from his previous use of 25 per week after he got his DUI. So he did slow down. The DUI kind of scared him a little bit, but it wasn't enough to make him stop. He also admitted to having more than 5 drinks in one sitting up to 6 times per year. And I will also side note here, his medical records did indicate a lot of this, and he was told by his doctor that he should probably cut back. Additionally, he had 2 DUIs, one in 2008, one in 2012. This, unfortunately, did come back as a decline from everybody. Due to the continued drinking, the alcohol criticisms within the APS, and those abnormal lab findings, the DUI history, there were patterns there that the underwriters just can't look past. And so this gentleman did unfortunately end up a decline. The only way we're probably going to get him coverage at this point will be with complete abstinence, and we'll have to see all those liver functions back in a normal range. And last case example. This one was very interesting to me, and I bring it up because we're seeing more and more like this every day now. This was a female in her mid 40s, non-smoker, standard build, pretty typical history, nothing of major significance over the years. She was currently drinking 4 to 6 alcoholic beverages per week, socially 1 to 3 times a week. So nothing too over the top by any means. However, she previously went to her physician with concerns of stress and anxiety, as well as self-reported over drinking. This young lady basically told the doctor she didn't intend to quit drinking. She didn't want to quit drinking. She just wanted better control. This was while she was at home during COVID. and was forced to work from home and was not leaving the house. She was drinking 6 to 8 drinks a night. She was also dealing with a lot of extra stress with some family situations, and she just felt life had gotten very overwhelming. She felt she was drinking too much, being stuck at home. She knew it was not healthy. She didn't necessarily think she had a problem. She just knew she was going down a path that she wasn't happy with. So she reported all of this to her doctor. Her doctor puts all of this in her records, and then all of a sudden, nothing. She didn't follow up on it again. Her doctor did start her on a medication, which she only took for a very short time. She didn't like the way it felt, and she did not want to stop. She just wanted control. So that medication was not going to suit her needs necessarily. And at that point, she quit with the med. She went on about her life, still drinks on a regular basis. There's no additional follow-ups. There's no other mention of this in her records. She didn't seek any additional assistance. It just kind of stopped. And because of that, we actually got all declines on this as well. Um, I hate showing you the negative ones, but I point this one out because we have seen a couple different things in underwriting since COVID. One has been increased alcohol abuse because people were bored and at home and stressed and didn't know what else to do. And, a lot of different organizations did things like Zoom and wine, and they'd have webinars and wine, and it kind of became a super fun thing for the companies to do. But unfortunately, it also encouraged a lot of day drinking and then people were home earlier, so they'd start drinking earlier, or they could sleep in later, so they'd stay up later drinking. So we did see a huge increase, honestly, in abuse in general. But what we did also see are cases exactly like this, where it wasn't your traditional abuse, if you will. It was more situational. And unfortunately, once those things are in a person's medical records, it's really hard to get them taken out, and it's impossible for an underwriter to overlook it. In this situation, I think we might have been able to get her coverage had there been some more follow-ups, had there been um, more decreased drinking on her part. There may have been things we could have done over time and may still be able to over time. But the situation as it was left with her just stopping the meds and coming right out and saying, no, I don't want to quit. I just want better control. But then continuing with no further guidance, it just kind of stopped this one right in its tracks. All right. So how can IAMS help on these? Well, first and foremost, we have lots of great fact finders out on our website, iamsinc.com. We have a very generic health screening questionnaire that covers pretty much everything you might want to ask a customer on your first or second meeting to kind of get their overall history. In addition to this, we do have NAILBA guides on our website. They are more ailment specific. There is one for drug use history, there is one for alcohol use history, there is one for every ailment that you can pretty much think of that we see commonly in underwriting, whether that be diabetes, fatty liver, kidney transplants, all the different things. They're very specific to whatever ailment you may have questions about. And with these, you can forward those to me at Andrea@iamsinc.com, and then we can discuss that insured's history. I can shop it out with all the carriers. As we've seen in some of those underwriting examples, not all carriers are created equal. This is why a lot of times in tougher cases like these, I will go to pretty much everybody because as we saw, we had declines from multiple carriers, but still got standard from one. So not all carriers are created equal. And we can work with your sales director on advanced case design. And we can use those questionnaires anytime appropriate. It's a little time consuming on the front end. We know that, and there can be some uncomfortable questions. However, that can save an immense amount of time on the back end. It is so much better if we shop these up front and we find the right carrier the first time rather than going to the wrong carrier, getting an MIB hit, getting a decline, having to pivot, 2 months into the process, and now you've got a frustrated client and you're having to resell the case for the second or third time. So incorporating these on the front end, I highly, highly recommend. It's going to be a lot easier process for everybody if we address these situations right up front and find the best home for them. And with that, I sure appreciate you joining me today. Please follow and like us on Facebook, also on LinkedIn. You can reach me at andrea@iamsinc.com or email at prescreen@iamsinc.com. And if you have any questions, please do feel free to give us a call. Thanks so much and have a great night.